director of the Martinsville-Henry County Historical Society. And I'm so glad to see y'all here. And you are in for an absolutely superb program. Jarred Marlowe is our presenter. He, along with Andy Goss, do just tremendous amounts of original research into matters of local history. And they put them together in on a YouTube channel called History in Sight, right? History in Sight, Doss and Marlowe. And it's a wonderful, Andy recently gave a program on the history of Edgewood and Firestone, and we're going to have that program here. And then Jarred has put this together on the history of funerals. Now, he is a graduate of Virginia Military Institute, and he's a member of the Colonel George Waller Sons of the American Revolution. He is a consultant for the Blue and Gray Education Society, and, which is particularly exciting for us right now, is he is the chairman of the local VA 250 committee celebrating the anniversary of the United States and Virginia, and we have a great program coming up on that in August on the 9th, and he's chairing that. He's bringing the speakers together, and perhaps even more excitingly and impressively, he got the VA 250 Mobile Museum to come to Martinsville, open that day, Sunday, August 9th. A very unique and special treat that we will have. So we will call up Jarred and be prepared to be entertained. Since we're on the subject of death, and as he's walking up, I will say that there is a Facebook page called Obituaries MHC, which runs the local obituaries the way the Bulletin used to do that several years ago before they stopped. And that's because I worked with the Bulletin at that time period, and I modeled the page after the way Sue Carter and Jenny Ray and still follow those rules. And so if you need to know the updates on obituaries, it's called Obituaries MHC. Everything is on public settings, so you don't need to do the friend request to see it. So there's your obituaries. Now let's talk about the funerals.
All right. Well, thank y'all so much for coming out. It's been a few years since I gave my last talk here. It's always nice to come back and be with people who are like-minded when it comes to local history. Thank you all for supporting events like this, because without events like this, a lot of the local stories that happen here wouldn't get told. Hopefully, you'll learn a couple things today. There's a couple things in here that I may need your help on. But today we're going to talk about an aspect of history that's kind of off the beaten path. But I would submit that it's the one aspect of history that is going to impact every single person in this room. You may not have an ancestor who fought in the Civil War or World War I. You may not have ancestors who are from here. Like my family is not from here. We grew up just east of here, or we live just east of here. But this is the one aspect of history that I think will not only impact every single person in this room, but because of its nature, it isn't really talked about. So today we are going to discuss the history of funerals and funeral traditions, and I'm going to end it by talking about local funeral home history and how the local funeral homes in this area came to be. So why choose the topic of death and funerals? Well, I think that's a very valid question, especially for someone who's in their early 30s like myself, who is not quite at the estate planning level yet. As with most things in my life, I can revert it back to my wife, and she's not here, so I can talk about her. So we have two little girls now. One's 6 and one's 10 months. When the 6-year-old was a little bit younger, we would take her down to my mom's, who lives in Cowens, for some much needed Nana time. And for all of you grandmothers in here, you know how important Nana time is. So we would drop her off at Nana's, and then we would go into Chatham, and there's a nice little coffee shop there, a nice little bookstore. And right across the street from the coffee shop stands the Simpson Funeral Museum. And my wife is more into the strange and macabre than I am. I tend to focus on, local history, wars, etc. She's more into that part of history. So she tells me one day, hey, that seems like something that I would like to go visit. And I had heard about the Simpson Funeral Museum. It opened when I was away at college, and I hadn't really kept up with it much. But being the dutiful husband that I tried to be, I was like, you know what, if you want to go, we'll go. So I called the number on the door and scheduled an appointment. And heading down there, I had it in my mind that we were going to be shown around by this like hunched over, old man who was like showing off his prized treasures, and he's like quietly beckoning you to the next exhibit and stuff like that. So in my head, I was like, this is not going to be fun. Let's just, do our hour here and get out, drop some money in the donation box and head on back up the road. But when I got there, I was extremely surprised. The guy leading the tour his name was Scott Simpson. He was in his probably mid-40s at the time, and super energetic, high energy. And what I thought was going to be a very strange and, for lack of better words, macabre visit turned out to be one of the coolest experiences I've ever had in my life. And we ended up going back there 5 or 6 more times before they closed their doors this past December. Here's a picture from last May, actually. They had the largest exhibit of Fisk iron coffins in the entire world there on Main Street in Chatham. And we'll talk more about Fisk iron coffins here in a second. But you can see it's very well lit, very inviting, nothing strange or mysterious or spooky about it. They have a 1930s Packard Henny hearse there. They have the original 1870s hearse that was in the town of Chatham that's been fully restored. But what really caught my eye was in the very back right corner back here, there was a huge poster on the wall. And it kind of summed up the mood for this afternoon. It was a quote by Sir William Gladstone, who was the Prime Minister of the UK back in the 1880s, 1890s. And he says, "Show me the manner in which a nation or community cares for its dead, and I will measure with mathematical exactness the tender sympathies of its people, their respect for the laws of the land, and their loyalty to high ideals." Now, I'm not here to get political or anything today, but I do think there is some truth in this. The last few decades, think about how much funerals and the way we remember the dead has changed. For me, when I was a kid, that was 20 some years ago, it used to be standard practice that visitation was one night, and then the funeral was the next day, and that was so people who could not make the funeral could go to the visitation the night before, get off work and whatever. Versus today, where most everything is either a celebration of life or the visitation and funeral are done back to back. It seems as though society has sped up and kind of lost its care for the dead. And you can, if you want to equate that to the moral degradation of society, that's on you. But I do think that our lives have become seemingly so hectic that we simply just don't have time for those who have passed on anymore, which I think is a real shame. Now, a lot of you in here have heard me talk before, and I've talked about other things, and one of the things I like to talk about is the Civil War. So if you're coming here today hoping I would talk Civil War, well, you were in luck. Because the root of the American funeral, I believe, gets its start in the Civil War. So May 23rd, 1861, Virginia declares its secession from the United States. And May 24th, word finally travels all throughout the state, and there is a young man by the name of Colonel Elmer Ephraim Ellsworth, who is in charge of the 10th New York Zouaves, which is actually a firefighter brigade from New York. And as states started seceding in the South, Lincoln called for some volunteers to come. So Ellsworth and some men from his town in Mechanicsville, New York, come down to Washington, D.C., and they're stationed just outside the nation's capital, kind of waiting to see what the South is going to do. Well, in May, when Virginia declares its secession, in Alexandria, there is an inn and tavern called the Marshall House Inn that is owned by a very ardent secessionist named James Jackson. When he gets word that Virginia has officially seceded from the United States, he runs up to the roof, takes down the American flag, and puts up the makeshift Confederate States of America flag that he has. And you can see the flagpole on the building right there. So you can see how high above the building that flag would have been. Well, the flag was so noticeable that it was said to be that it could be seen through a pair of binoculars from the White House in the Capitol. Well, Ellsworth was not going to let that stand. He was a young, hotshot lawyer from New York and a close personal friend and former law clerk of a guy by the name of Abraham Lincoln. So Ellsworth does what any young brash officer will do. He rouses his men, and they get in boats and sail across, or row across the Potomac, land in Alexandria. Keep in mind, the war has not begun yet. Manassas is still a couple months away. So Ellsworth and his men march to the Marshall House Tavern. They run inside, run up the stairs, and Ellsworth personally goes to the roof, pulls down the flag, and raises up again the United States flag. Well, while all this commotion is going on, James Jackson, the proprietor, is sleeping in bed. So one of his staff wakes him and says, "Hey, the Union Army is here and they're taking down your flag." Jackson gets out of bed, grabs his shotgun, and runs out his door, where he meets Ellsworth coming back down the stairs, and he puts the barrel of the gun in Ellsworth's chest and fires. And here we have the first officer death of the Civil War. And here's Ellsworth's coat that's on display. I forget at which museum, but you can see point blank from a shotgun. Ellsworth is dead before he hits the ground. Now, one of Ellsworth's men who went with him, Private Lewis Brownell, then takes his bayonet and bayonets Jackson to the wall, which is depicted right here. Now, even though this is not the first Medal of Honor issued during the Civil War, this is the first Medal of Honor act of the Civil War, when Brownell bayonets and kills Jackson for killing Ellsworth. And there's Brownell. That's there. You can see his Medal of Honor right there. He was awarded it years later. Well, word of this goes quickly back across the river. And it's well known that Ellsworth is a personal friend of Lincoln. The Lincoln family knows him very well. But word goes specifically to a guy by the name of Dr. Thomas Holmes. Thomas Holmes is practicing a new form of science and chemistry with the dead called embalming. Fortunately, Holmes has a very close friend by the name of Secretary of State William Seward. Holmes goes to Seward and says, "Hey, I have a way that we can honor Ellsworth's legacy and get him home to his parents for burial in New York," which we think of as just being commonplace. Well, yeah, you're buried where you grew up or where you want to be. Back then, when you died, you were buried pretty much where you died. It didn't matter where that was. There was no way of transporting bodies efficiently. So Holmes tells Seward, "I need an audience with President Lincoln." Seward tells Holmes, "Not now." The president's obviously very busy trying to digest what could be the first shots of the American Civil War. Holmes insists that Seward at least grant him a few minutes with the president, and then after some very ardent urging, Holmes is finally granted his audience with Lincoln. He explains what he's going to do to Ellsworth's body and the purposes of it, and more importantly, that they now had a way to get Ellsworth back home to his parents in New York, and that would be the best way to honor his legacy. Lincoln agrees to try this new tactic of embalming, so Holmes takes his body and takes it to the local firehouse, which is kind of ironic given Ellsworth and his men's occupation before the war. And he there embalms the body in one of the firehouses in Washington, D.C. After the body is fully embalmed, it is then placed in a coffin, and then Ellsworth lies in state in the White House, where he is visited by many government dignitaries and army officers, being one of the first bodies to lie in state in the White House. More importantly to this story, though, he is visited by Mary Todd Lincoln, who makes a remark to her husband that it looks as Ellsworth is, quote, only sleeping. That will come back into play a little bit later. Ellsworth, after lying in state, is then put on a train and shipped back home, where he is buried in the family plot in Mechanicsville, New York. Now, we take this for granted, like I said before, that when you pass away, it doesn't matter where in the world you are, that we have the technology to get your body back home, and your family can grieve and bury it into it with as it wishes. But for 160 years ago, this was radical technology. So, how did we get from here to there? Well, the story dates all the way back, I think, to almost prehistoric times. To start any funeral topic or any funeral talk, you have to first mention the Egyptians. The Egyptians were very noted for their mummification of the dead, which essentially involved taking all the organs out of the body, in creative ways. I know, for example, they tried to pull the brain through the nose, so you can imagine that. But they dehydrated the bodies, kind of entombed them in salt, and then wrapped them, and then laid them out to display. But they were essentially dehydrating the body, and this is maybe a crude way to think of it, but think about beef jerky. They were kind of doing that to the body. They were preserving it for as long as they could under the arid conditions of the time, which the arid air in Egypt was not a friend of decomposition and actually preserved bodies naturally. But they were the first to kind of patent this technique, and they embalmed everything. People, cats, flowers, bugs, you name it, they figured out how to pump it full of salt and dry it out. But they were the first to kind of note it for it. But I want to make note that they were not the only ones who were practicing mummification. We have seen at least 5 or 6 other examples across the world of what other Native American tribes or people across the Pacific Rim were doing. Like, for example, the Alouettes in Alaska would use the temperature to their advantage and kind of freeze the bodies, essentially. The same with people in the Inca, of course, you know, it's high elevation. My favorite, though, is the Anga from Papua New Guinea, in which they kind of smoked the body, encased it in mud, and then hung it on scaffolds so they could overlook the village. So, you know, your dead were literally looking down on you. But again, I'd say all this to make the point that the Egyptians were not some radical group doing this. There were groups across the world who were experimenting with this stuff at the same time as the Egyptians. But the earliest burial rituals we see date back thousands of years. You may have heard of things like burial mounds for Native Americans. We've seen throughout history the desire for people to be buried together. And the picture I have here is of the Paris catacombs, and they said they have found 1.2 million different bodies in there. So that's what all those stacked up bones are for. But even thousands of years ago, there was this innate desire to bury the dead with each other, to be together in life and in death. So we see bodies being buried together. Now, there are a number of reasons for that. First could be financial. It's kind of costly to make every single spot where somebody dies a cemetery or a graveyard, which, by the way, does anybody know the difference between a graveyard and a cemetery? Because there is a difference. Yes?
One is for the church and one is for the family.
Correct. The graveyard is typically attached to a church. A cemetery is a plot of land with bodies buried on it. So then when you think graveyard, think church. I know in our language we kind of use them both interchangeably, but there is an actual difference. So we see families desiring to be buried together. We see it due to cost reasons, especially in towns and cities. It became a lot more convenient for the city or town to rope off a certain parcel of land and bury people there, as opposed to just putting them out back of every home. But the more common reason that people are buried together is actually religious. If you think about how churches and other religions worked back in the day, especially within the Catholic Church, it became a very prized and noteworthy thing if your cathedral held something of significance. If you had the bones of a certain saint, or you had some sort of artifact that you could say, hey, we have, the femur bone of, St. Thomas of Aquinas or whatever. People thought that the closer they were to God, the more elevated they would be in the afterlife. So what churches started doing is they started auctioning off plots within the church, which is why a lot of the older dignitaries of England and stuff are buried inside the church, because it was a very high esteemed place to be buried in the same building that had these relics that were of great note. So once when the church started making money off of having people buried inside, but once the church itself got full, then people were paying for the places right outside, which is how graveyards got started. People wanted to be as close to the religious center of their community as they could. Moving into colonial America and then into America after the Revolution, early colonial funerals, keep in mind who the first settlers of our area or our country were. They were Puritans, they were Quakers, they were breaking off from the Catholic Church. So they wanted their early funerals to be as anti-Catholic as possible, which means no pageantry, no flash, no pomp, no circumstance. So early colonial funerals were conducted in a way that no words were said. They would silently carry your body out to your grave, drop it in, fill up the dirt. No one would say a word, and then everybody would go home. If you were a noted person in the community, be it clergy or an elevated lay person like a town councilman, they may read scripture at your funeral, but those would be the only words that were said. So, just kind of put that in perspective today, where the modern funeral is based around people getting up and talking about their loved one, or sharing stories. 400 years ago, 300, 400 years ago, you were lucky if you had a word spoken at your funeral. And I included this picture of this early colonial tombstone because I think those are just fascinating to look at. Just the amount of sheer craftsmanship that went into those. Today, headstones are kind of very uniform as far as the font style, and it's very rare to see a unique headstone nowadays, especially in this day and age. But the early colonial and American stuff, that's sheer craftsmanship right there. I just love seeing those. But as we developed as a nation, our funeral traditions started to change a little bit. But again, people started talking more and more at funerals, and it became common for things called eulogies to start happening, or you would have a preacher come there and read scripture over you. That became more and more common as generations passed. But we also start to see a little bit of extra pageantry that didn't exist in the Catholic Church start to be developed. First and foremost, it became a thing back in those days, the late 17th and 18th century, to collect funeral tokens from somebody. And the popular item of the day was gloves. So you would set aside part of your estate that when you died, you would go out and purchase 20 sets of gloves, and it became a thing to collect community gloves. Like, you have the gloves of John Smith, you have the gloves of so and so. Like, that became, the more gloves you had, the better off you were. The more people liked you. We also see the evolution of what we would call today a funeral director. This guy is called the aanspreker, and that's a Dutch term. So what the aanspreker would do is, when you had a loved one pass away, you would go notify this person in your community, and you would say, hey, my Uncle John, passed away. Here's a list of people who we do want at the funeral, and do not invite these other people. And he would go to the houses of the people who you invited and specifically invite them to your funeral. It was very cultural taboo to show up at a funeral that you were not invited to. So I forget the exact translation for aanspreker, but the spreka part would be the speaker. Eventually this role would transition into, hey, since I'm already here, would you like for me to find somebody to go out and dig your grave? Would you like for me to go and order a coffin from the local craftsman? So this is kind of how the modern day funeral director role started to develop, and we see that in the 17 and 1800s. Also, we start to see things more elaborate. It is said that when the great-grandson of Governor John Winthrop died, they fired cannons and rifles over his grave for a 24-hour period, burning up 7 kegs of gunpowder. So it's a very stark traditional change from his great-grandfather, who when he was buried probably had some 6 words said at his funeral, and they moved on. We also see the advancement and starting to see the usage of, for the more wealthy in society, metal sarcophaguses, sarcophagi, the plural. So wood back then would deteriorate after a while, and you probably have seen pictures of sunken in graves where the wood is rotted out and the ground is falling in with it. Well, in order to prevent that, they said, well, metal will last a lot longer than wood. So we see the more wealthy start having metal-lined coffins. That was the standard practice until the 1840s. And then, in the 1840s, this guy by the name of Almond Fisk changed the game. Almond Fisk was a cast iron stove maker in New York. And Almond Fisk had a brother who was traveling across the United States, and he was somewhere in the middle part of America when his brother got sick and died. Well, keep in mind, back then, if you died and you weren't at your home, they buried you in the town that you died in. So Almond Fisk didn't like this. He didn't like that his brother was thousands of miles away and he didn't have a way to get him home. So he sat down and started figuring out, how can we create a technology that will move and transport bodies, back then by rail, because that was the way to do it the most efficiently. So he created what he called the iron coffin. Now, stop right here for a second. Does anyone know the difference between a coffin and a casket? Because there is also a difference between those. A coffin is body shaped. So when you think coffin, you've probably seen it, head, broad shoulders, but it gets narrower as it goes down. A casket is simply just what we would call a rectangle. No form or flair to it, it's just a box. So he created what we now know as the Fisk iron coffin. And in his design, it was completely cast iron. When a person would die, if they were wealthy enough, or their family was wealthy enough to transport their body, they would put their body into this airtight cast iron coffin, seal it. You see the screws right there. They would seal it and then transport it by train to get the body back home. This is what they look like. This was at the Simpson Funeral Museum. Now, you may be thinking, that is a very small container. Well, it was designed to be that way. The two biggest things that cause decomposition in bodies are air and water. So he was taking out all the air. They literally had to cram your body into there and close it. There wasn't a room for you, for anything else in there besides your body. And no surprise to many, the majority of them that were produced were for infants, because of the infant mortality rate and child mortality rate back in the day. Now, back then, you could have gotten, two of these for around 13, 14 months. So, I'm kind of put that in perspective for today. But this technology quickly went away because, keep in mind, this is the 1840s, and then not 20 years later, the Civil War would come and they would start rationing metals, and Fisk himself eventually lost the patents and died penniless and bankrupt, and other companies started producing it and it just wasn't the same. So it kind of died out with that. But also because there was this new technology coming out of France called embalming. You had these two guys. First one, his name was Jean-Nicolas Guénon. Guénon had this chemical formula that he would use that was heavily based in aluminum acetate and sulfate, in which he would pump into bodies and it would preserve them for longer periods of time so they could be laid out and viewed. Well, this other guy, Jean-Pierre Suquet, tried that method, but it wasn't working as well for him, so he created his own chemical formula that uses zinc chloride. And these two men kind of had a battle of wits. They said one day, they were in France, and they had this friendly competition. We'll both embalm a body on the same day, and 1 year later we'll come back and check it and see which one is more decomposed. So they had this competition. 1 year later, it was proven that the zinc chloride formula was the better one. Guénon's did show some signs of decay, but not much. But Suquet's looked exactly the way that it did when it was embalmed. So back then, they didn't really sell embalming fluid because there was no usable way to transport this toxic chemical. So what they would do is they would sell you the chemical formula and the recipe, and you would create it yourself. So we see the first embalming fluid come to America in the early 1840s, and this was by Dr. Richard Harlan. He was a dentist, so take from that what you will. But he was using Guénon's formula, and then we see Charles Brown, also a dentist in Manhattan, start using Suquet's formula, and Suquet's formula is roughly what is used today in embalming, that same chemical compound. And now they've obviously advanced it and changed it with modern times, but Suquet's method is still the heavily preferred one. But we see embalming coming into America starting in the early 1840s. But it was a radical science, and it was very expensive because the doctor would have to go mix the chemicals himself and then do it. Then the Civil War came, and the more affluent families wanted ways to get their loved ones home. So what the wealthier families would do is they would pay these embalming doctors to follow the Civil War camps around, and if their loved one was killed in the field of battle, then these doctors would go in, take the body out, embalm it, and ship it home. So, along with all the camp stragglers and stuff, people who were fixing the meals and all the supplies and stuff, behind them was some doctors who were going to embalm the dead. So, kind of an eerie sense that these guys were literally just following Civil War armies around for the entire war. Now, funny thing about this picture, there's less deceased people in this picture than you think. These two guys are very much alive, but they saw the opportunity to have their picture taken, so they hopped in coffins and there they are. So, because it's a very new technology, because it's very expensive still, only 6% of the 650,000 casualties of the Civil War were embalmed, which is a very small fraction. Other doctors tried ways to preserve bodies, including putting sawdust in them to get them home, but obviously that wouldn't be the preferred method. It's kind of like putting sawdust in an engine. But we do see embalming happening in the Civil War. Now, back to the story I told you before. All the stuff with Colonel Ellsworth happened in 1861. In 1862, Abraham and Mary Todd Lincoln have a son pass away, little Willie. When it comes time for what to do with his body, Mary Todd remembers that there's a way that her son's body can be preserved so she can spend more time grieving, as all mothers who have lost children would prefer to do. So she has her son, Willie, embalmed so she can spend more time with him before he is buried. Fast forward 3 years, April 1865. Abraham Lincoln is assassinated in Ford's Theater. Now, if you know anything about the story of Lincoln after his death, it's quite an arduous one. Lincoln's body is then transported from D.C. to Springfield, Illinois, but it takes a long time to get there because they stop at every train stop so mourners can come out and see the president. This is a picture from that. But Abraham Lincoln's death and then later his ride back to Illinois was, in my opinion, the first truly modern American funeral, because we see all of these aspects come into play at once. So we see the notification of the community. Obviously, people knew that Lincoln was killed. So massive notification of the community. Public viewing of the embalmed body. People could come out to their local train station, or they could travel because they knew where the body was going to be and view the corpse of their former president. It was a religious funeral service. It was transportation to the grave for burial. A lot of times we take hearses for granted, but it was the first time that one of the first times that a body had been transported to a grave using mass transit. And then permanent memorialization. If you've ever been to the Abraham Lincoln cemetery today, it's a spectacle. And we see all of these elements come into play together for the first time. And we take a lot of this stuff for granted because, well, yeah, that's, I see an obituary and, there's a visitation time and there's a, graveside service and the body is transported there by hearse. And, a lot of the stuff that just we take for granted as being status quo for a funeral. But this was the first time all of the elements came together. So, as things start to evolve and change, a new industry that we now know as the funeral industry takes off. Oh, now, there was no really way back then of, creating embalmers, creating funeral directors. So what a lot of businesses did was they just added mortician services to their already existing business. So here we see Craig and Bassett, which is, on Main Street in Bassett. We see General Merchandise, Country Produce, undertakers. So a lot of times it was the person who made the furniture in the area. They just turned, instead of making, tables and chairs, they made a couple of coffins. And that was your undertaker. And with this, your local businessman kind of became your first funeral directors and had the first funeral industry. It was an already existing industry that they just attached on to their businesses. So the way that it worked was, when you had a loved one pass away, the local undertaker would be notified, And they would load up a wagon with all of the stuff that they would need, be it embalming fluid, but if you weren't being embalmed, then stuff they would need to wash and prepare the body. They would ride out to your residence, and they would come and do any preparation that was needed. Typically, that was for families in this area probably couldn't afford embalming. They would wash the body, get it dressed, prepare it, and do everything that they needed to do while being in the family's home. And then once everything was prepared, the undertaker would then put the body into the parlor of the home, which is where we get the phrase funeral parlor. And typically it was common practice for someone to stay with the body all throughout the night until the service the next day. Hence why we call visitations wakes, because people, were staying awake with the body. Now, embalming was still not a common practice in late 1800s and 1900s, as evident in 1934. Only 25% of all deaths were embalmed. Keep in mind the people who lived in this area, they probably couldn't afford anything luxurious or fancy. So the undertaker would come out to their house, prepare the body, sit with it all night. The next day they would have a service and put it in the family cemetery, which is probably located in the backyard or somewhere very close by that they could transport on the undertaker's cart. So back then, keep in mind, family cemeteries were a thing. That's why they're still existing in a lot of people's backyards or out in the woods somewhere, and that was the family cemetery. We see church graveyards also start to take off and really expand in the late 19th, early 20th century. And then municipal cemeteries, like, for example, Oakwood here in Martinsville got its start in the late 19th century because it was a municipal spot for people who lived within Martinsville and surrounding areas to place their dead that wasn't a family cemetery because they probably didn't have enough room in their backyards. And this is just a generic picture of what it would have looked like to have a funeral inside your house. Now, there is still the option to do that. I heard of one recently where the lady wanted everything to be done in her house, so you can still do that, but it's probably a lot more costly to get them to change their logistics for the funeral. So this is a contraption called a jack-in-the-box. So undertakers would buy this, and it's kind of hard to see. There's a black suitcase right there, and all of this would fold up and fit inside that. So in order to have your loved one look presentable, the undertaker would pack this cot and this kneeling prayer. I forget what it's called. It's called a prie de lieu in French. I forget what it's called. It's a kneeling prayer station. They'll pack those two and the jack-in-the-box up in the back of their cart. So when your loved one was displayed, they had a nice velvet curtain behind them. They were laying on a velvet-lined cot, and it was a very nice thing. It didn't look like the corner of your living room. It was a very elaborate display. So you can see here, very, very fancy, very, nice for that area, but it's still in somebody's house. This is a unique technology of the late 19th, early 20th century. This is an ice chest coffin. If you didn't want to, or if you wanted to preserve your loved one for a while but not embalm them, they would fill this top part here with ice and lay your body beneath it. And they would open up this little viewing hole so your loved ones could look down on you. But the ice kept you preserved for a lot longer than just keeping you out in the elements. Because keep in mind, especially here in the South, warm air and moisture in the air is going to lead to rapid decomposition. So putting ice on you, and there's a drain hole at this end for the ice that's melting. It could keep you preserved for a lot longer in case you had families coming in from out of town. If you were really fancy and you lived in a municipal area, you could have your body taken to the local cemetery by a horse-drawn hearse. These are pretty impressive things from back in the day. They're actually built concave on the sides, so it looks like it's a very narrow thing that your body slides into, but inside it's very spacious. But funeral directors would drive these, transporting your body from your home to the cemetery, and if you wanted to ride in style. And here's the one that was in the Simpson Funeral Museum. This was the one that was actually in Chatham back in the day, which I always thought was pretty unique. I want to take a slight left turn here and talk about the funeral industry for African Americans, because it's at this time in history that we see the African American funeral industry start to come alongside the white American funeral industry. White Americans did not want to be in charge of taking care of African American bodies, so the African American funeral industry kind of takes off because it's one industry that they can do themselves without any interference from white Americans. And that's kind of a lot of the reason why it's still heavily bifurcated today. It's traditional, you have African American funeral homes and you have white funeral homes. And it gets its root here because of the two different sects not wanting to interact with each other. So here's some funeral bills from back in the day. So actually no, this is for caskets. So you could get 3 caskets and all the accoutrements for $44 in 1906. So if you've ever purchased a casket recently, you know that's ludicrous today. Here's a funeral bill from 1919, and total cost was $271, all in. For those of you who were not here when I first got here, I've got some stuff here on the back table for you to look at before you leave. I got a funeral bill from the early 1900s from Brooklyn, and the all-in funeral was like $200-something. This is a picture of a sign that was in the Simpson Funeral Museum. As you can see, it was Chatham Furniture and Undertaking. And ironically, the Simpson Funeral Museum was actually in the old Chatham Furniture and Undertaking building, which made it such a cool location before it closed. And here's a picture of a funeral bill from Craig and Bassett. So in 1945, a total funeral was $495. So the evolution from that to the modern funeral, we start to see vaults become a thing in the early 19-teens because of the ground caving in, because of the wood coffins and wood caskets. They would give way, the ground would cave in. So cemeteries, especially a lot of your public ones, wanted a way to keep the ground from caving in. So they started requiring metal vaults to be placed into the ground, which they put. And the vaults had already existed. I mean, if you think back to ancient Egypt, that's what the sarcophagus was. It was essentially a vault to put a body in. But now it's almost common practice now, especially public cemeteries require that a vault be put in for groundskeeping purposes. We also see the shift in the early 20th century from coffins to caskets. Caskets are much more easily produced because if you think about a coffin, it has to be shaped. It requires craftsmanship, it requires effort and time, whereas caskets can just be nailed together, or in this case of modern day caskets, welded together. It's just 4 pieces of metal. I talked to a guy who made caskets, and he said that you can pour metal into a mold and pump out a casket just like you can a car bumper. It's essentially just how fast can you do it. And so caskets became a lot more common because they became a lot cheaper and easier to produce. And they're more aesthetically pleasing. There's something about not seeing a body-shaped thing that that distracts our minds from what's actually in there. So if we see just a rectangle, we think, oh, that's not as doom and gloom as a body-shaped coffin. But the main thing that changed the funeral industry was the invention of the automobile, because before the undertakers had to come to you. Now they can do everything in their shop, and they don't have to pick up everything and carry it out to your house to do everything. Now they'll come get you and then do everything there. And that's when we see the birth of the funeral home, because it becomes done in the mortician's home. Here's some more antique items that were at the funeral museum. This is an antique embalming table. As you can tell, it sits on a slant, so the blood can drain into here. There's a little motor that would pump the embalming fluid in, and as it was pumping in the embalming fluid in, the blood would be forced out. And here's all the antique embalming equipment. I've got a couple of antique embalming fluid bottles up here, if you want to see them. So funeral homes became a thing. Undertakers and morticians started practicing out of their homes. They would live on the second story and then use the first story as the family business, and hence funeral home. It was their home. But they needed ways and more efficient ways to transport bodies to and from. And again, in the early 20th century, we see the invention of the hearse. Now, some bright person said, okay, if we can transport dead bodies with this thing, we can also transport live bodies with this thing. So hearses and funeral services became your first ambulance service. It was nothing for you to, fall and break your leg and call the funeral home to come transport you to the hospital in the back of a hearse. I talked to Bill Collins Jr. when I was doing my research for this, and he said that there was literally just a lever that you pulled between to accommodate a gurney as opposed to a casket. And you literally flip the switch, and that was it. But can you imagine having to ride to the hospital in the back of this? Because that was the case for up until the 1960s, really. And here's a price schedule from McKee's Funeral Home in the 1940s for how much they would charge you to take you in the back of a hearse from Martinsville to either Roanoke, Danville, Winston, Durham, all the way to Lynchburg or Charlottesville. So you were riding all that way in the back of a hearse with maybe somebody sitting beside you in a chair. So quite the way to travel, right? Now, if you're like me, I grew up remembering that funeral home advertisements were everywhere in our house. We had a phone on the wall. There was a funeral home calendar. There were magnets. There were everything that seemed to be a funeral home. I was like, well, this is kind of depressing. But there was a reason for that. If you fell and you, like I said, busted your leg, the funeral home wanted you to have their number close by in case you needed to call them for an ambulance service. So here we see, this is a fan from Craig and Bassett, again, promotional advertisements. A lot of funeral homes still do like the fans in the backs of churches and stuff, but it's in that similar vein. They have their day phone and their night phone. So if something happens, you can call them day or night. And here's another one. I found this pretty cool. This is in the Bath Historical Center. Here's a picture from McKee Funeral Home back when FDR was president. But again, here's our funeral phone number. Here's a calendar from 1999. They were still doing this in 1999, but they wanted to put their number everywhere in case you needed them day or night. And it's still kind of that way because a lot of times, death is inconvenient. But we have a lot better access to phone numbers and stuff. Cremation. This is one of the topic that seems to be pretty hot nowadays, no pun intended. Cremation has existed since prehistoric times. Everybody from the Viking funerals, you may have heard of Viking funerals where they did a funeral pyre and set the body on top of the pyre, and there's the picturesque of putting the body on a canoe and lighting the canoe on fire and pushing it out. That didn't really happen unless you were really dignified because they're wasting a boat. The Romans did it a lot too. There's a lot of pictures that you can go look up of Roman funeral pyres where they did it right in the middle of the city, putting the body on top of the pyre, lighting it. So cremation is not a new thing. Cremation has always existed, but cremation starts taking off for modern society in the 1870s, which is the first crematory opened in England. This is a picture of it. I forget the name of it, but it's still standing today. And then a few decades later, we see that trend come across the pond to the United States. But where cremation starts to really take hold as the preferred method for deceased bodies starts in the 1960s when the Pope, I forget which Pope it was. It'll come to me when I least need it. It's like 4 hours from now. Pius X, yes. He made cremation acceptable in the Catholic Church. So starting in the 1960s, we see cremation numbers start to rise, and they have not fallen since. To put it in perspective, in 1913, the United States total had 52 cremations, or crematories with 10,000 cremations, and 60 years later, 425, 150,000, and 7 years ago, there were 3,000 with 1.5 million cremations done. So within 100 years or so, you go from 10,000 to 1.5 million. Locally, so this is within a 20-mile radius, in the 1950s, there were less than 10 cremations done on average per business a year. Less than 10. In the 1990s, cremation became about 10% of total business, which means graveside services and full-service funerals were still 90% of the business. And now, depending on which funeral home you talk to, the average is about 25% end in cremation. But if you go just south of Greensboro or to Roanoke, that number jumps substantially to 60 to 80% of all deaths in cremation. So, I don't want to sound like I'm totally against cremation, because there are a lot of cons to burying people in the ground. If you take an average 10-acre cemetery, so to put it in perspective, I think Roselawn is 26 acres, to put it in perspective. There's enough coffin wood or casket wood in there to frame 40 houses. There's over 900 tons of casket metal. And there's 22,000 tons of vault concrete in a 10-acre plot. On top of that, every year the United States buries 800,000 gallons of embalming fluid that just goes straight into the ground. And you can kind of do the math. This is for a 10-acre cemetery. There's 1 million acres of cemeteries across the United States. So, yeah, it's kind of alarming. But it's no denying that the future is going to be in cremation. You see the cremation number there in black. It's doing nothing but rise. Here in, this is 2024, this data, you can see that most every state is in that 51% or above, with the exceptions being here in the South, of deaths that end in a cremation. So it's projected to be at 70% nationwide in the next 4 years. Now, I'm not for or against either one, but I do think there is something that needs to be said about remembering our dead. We're not grieving like we used to. A lot of times it's very, very much how fast can we get this process over with. I talked to a local funeral director, and he said that he's had on multiple occasions someone pass away locally and their loved ones live elsewhere, and the loved ones have given him a credit card and a mailing address from where to send the ashes. So, again, I'm not for or against it. That's your prerogative, but I do think we need to spend more time thinking about our dead and those who have come before us. So let's end today by talking about local funeral home history, as I think it's fascinating how the local funeral homes came to be, especially not being from this area. But I thought this would be a good way to end in a more upbeat way than talking about cremation and burial and stuff. Let's dive into it. The first funeral homes that we see, or funeral businesses that we see pop up, one is in Henry County, and the first instance I see of it, this picture was taken around 1909, and you see right there where it says C.C. Bassett Furniture, and below it, Undertaker. So this picture was 1909 Main Street in Bassett. This building stood roughly where the Wells Fargo is on Main Street in Bassett today. But you see that C.C. Bassett he had his furniture business, but below it he also had his undertaking business. Now C.C. Bassett himself was not an undertaker, or not that we can find. He was an undertaker. He actually gave that responsibility to his brother's brother-in-law, a guy by the name of Morton Coleman. And Morton Coleman was the undertaker in Bassett for years. Switching gears here in Martinsville, how many of you remember where the Eagles building was in Martinsville? For those of you who don't know, it's right there where that parking lot sits. Just if you go walk out that door and look across where that parking lot sits, there used to be the Eagles building there. But before it was the Eagles, it was Stoltz and Shoemate Furniture. And Stoltz and Shoemate, on the second floor of what would become the Eagles building, operated the Martinsville Mortician School, where you could go to train to be a mortician. And that was kind of revolutionary for this area, because keep in mind, back then, these pictures were taken about 4 years apart, 1909, 1913. Here we have it as a side venture of an already existing business, and here they are training people to go into business on their own. Again, there are less deceased people in this picture than you think, especially that's wax. But yes, there was a mortician school